Sick building syndrome. Are your chronic symptoms due to an unhealthy building? And this might seem wacky to some people, but if you are someone who has suffered for a long time and you've seen 10 doctors, 20 doctors, 30 doctors without help, this may be part of your clinical puzzle, and it's far more common than you would think. And despite the fact that many government agencies, many doctors, many lawyers would say that buildings can't make you sick, the science would say otherwise. And so let's dive into some of that science and how you can, and some strategies to understand how you can tell if your building is making you sick or not. So we're discussing sick building syndrome, which I like the term chronic inflammatory response syndrome better, or CIRS for short. And the reason I like that better is because chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, can be caused by things, exposures other than sick buildings, whereas sick building syndrome, you would think sick building syndrome really would be a subclass of CIRS, okay? And that's just semantics that nerds like me would become nuanced about, but it's important because there are people that suffer with chronic issues that have seen tens of doctors that haven't been helped, that maybe it wasn't a building like it is in sick building syndrome. Okay, sick building syndrome patient might be suffering because of a water damaged building. And that is one way a CIRS patient could be triggered, but CIRS patients could also be triggered by, it could be post-Lyme, it could be long COVID, it could be ciguatera or Pfiesteria, which these are, ciguatera and Pfiesteria are toxins you pick up from, say, eating fish or swimming in a river that's got certain algal blooms in it. Algal bloom, I didn't spell that right. The L goes before the G. But you get the point. So there are multiple ways that you could have a chronic inflammatory response syndrome. We're going to focus on the building today, but I just wanted you to have that background. And so you may have experienced this. You may have, uh, well, let me back up. Either of these are going to cause, so what do the symptoms look like? Okay, the symptoms are going to be multiple, and the systems affected in the body are going to be multiple. Okay, so it's a multi-symptom, multi-system illness. What's that mean? So you might have the heart, you might have cardiovascular symptoms, you might have neurological symptoms, you might have respiratory symptoms, you might have musculoskeletal symptoms. So those are multiple symptoms across multiple body systems. And when you go to a medical doctor, that's so many that their heads explode, and they just, rather than do the detective work to figure it out, they give you a diagnosis like chronic fatigue syndrome or like fibromyalgia. Okay, and they say, here's this medication, or it's all in your head, see you later. Okay, but that's failing you if they haven't done the detective work to figure out what's behind this multi-symptom, multi-system illness. And in 7 minutes, it's impossible for them to do that. So it's never going to happen in a conventional medical office. And because the cause of your chronic multi-symptom, multi-system illness may be exposure to a water damaged building, since they don't ask about your home or your workspace on your questionnaire in terms of, is there water damage? Is there mold? Is there, do you have ceiling tiles that are moldy? Do you have that musty smell in your home? They don't ask those questions. They'll never even consider that. And so they give you one of these diagnoses, give you an antidepressant or a painkiller, and send you on your way. But something else that can confound that is they might label you those, or they might say you're crazy, right? And something that compounds that is sometimes even the spouse will think you're crazy. And the reason for that is that genetically 24% of the population is genetically susceptible to, I'm sorry, I can't spell and talk at the same time today, is genetically susceptible to this CIRS illness. And so what that would manifest as in real life is if someone's genetically susceptible, they walk into a water damaged building and they start having symptoms or a flare of their symptoms, and they say, ooh, I have to get out of here. And their spouse may not be one of the 24% that's susceptible. So their spouse doesn't notice anything, right? So for example, say I'm susceptible and my wife is not. We both walk into a Harris Teeter or a grocery store that is water damaged. Okay. And I start to notice symptoms. I say, oh, I got to get out of here. And she says, come on, you're crazy. We're just going in here to grab bananas. It's going to be 5 minutes and we'll be out of here. And I say, no, I got to leave. Okay. If you do that in multiple places, she or he is going to think you're crazy, or your doctor is going to think you're crazy. Well, let's do some math. 24% of the population, okay, the US has roughly 330 million people in it. If we call it 300 million for simple math, 24% of the population is 72 million people. Okay. Well, the FDA says that 50% of buildings in the United States are currently and or have a history of water damage. Okay. So you could see how if a quarter of the population is walking into half the buildings and always saying, I don't feel good, that could happen pretty commonly. And so the 3/4 of the population who do not notice that say a quarter of the population is crazy, right? 1/4 is crazy. But they aren't. That 1/4 is just, they're not crazy. They're what we would call mold dogs. They're genetic mold dogs. Their genes are more susceptible to the inflammation triggered by the biochemical soup in a water damaged building. And so they become inflamed. And the longer they stay in that building, they get what's called sicker quicker. Okay. So what we have in these patients is, one, we have exposure. And that exposure in the case of this video is a water damaged building. And 80% of CIRS patients are triggered by water damaged buildings. So this is by far the most common trigger is a water damaged building. So you must have exposure. Okay. Second, you have to have susceptibility. So again, if you're susceptible and your spouse isn't, your spouse is going to say, come on, you're weird, don't do that. But susceptibility happens, like we said, in 24% of the population genetically. And in CIRS cases, it's 95% of CIRS cases have that genetic susceptibility. So it is possible to have CIRS if you don't have the susceptibility. That's only 5% of cases. It's not very common. Okay. And then once you've got those two things, there's also a cluster of symptoms that is typical of CIRS patients. And what has been discovered by Dr. Richie Shoemaker is that there's 37 typical symptoms of a CIRS patient, and the adult CIRS patient averages 23 of 37 symptoms on average. Okay, so we said multi-symptom, multi-system illness. If you've got 23 different symptoms, you can see how a medical doctor with 7 minutes is going to default to you're crazy, or it's chronic fatigue, or fibromyalgia, right? And then lastly, there are objective lab findings that are expected in CIRS that are not seen in other things very commonly. And so CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, this is inflammation of the innate immune system. And the innate immune system, or conventional medicine's favorite inflammatory markers are things like C-reactive protein and erythrocyte sedimentation rate. Well, those things are normal in these patients. Why? Because those are inflammatory markers produced by the adaptive immune system, which is the second arm of the immune system. The innate immune system is the more primitive arm, the first arm. And so because these are normal, that would be another reason, hey, we keep checking you, you have all these symptoms, but your labs are not high, you're crazy. Or, one of these catch-all diagnoses, but they don't test the innate immune inflammatory markers, and so they don't see it. And so if you're someone that has all these multi-symptom symptoms, you've seen multiple doctors, you haven't been helped, these are things to look at. And what must be determined and asked about in the history is there any water damage building in your life? So, for example, and new homes are not ruled out here. So people will often tell me, yeah, well, we live in a new build, so it's not mold. And that's far from the truth. Actually, new builds, especially at the rate they're being thrown up around Charlotte, could very easily be thrown together quickly without the due diligence to, do it right and have water leaks. And so there's many issues you could have with windows and doors and crawl spaces and roofs and flashing and all these things that could be letting water through that is not visible, but in walls that is allowing mold and actinomycetes and endotoxins and all kinds of other inflammagens to live, grow, and spread that is impacting a genetically susceptible person. And so one way to figure out, is the building bothering you? Obviously, if you can see mold, mold under a floor, or mold behind a wall, or mold in ceiling tiles, that's an obvious thing. But you could have mold in a water damaged building without seeing it visibly like that. How much water damage is enough? If you've had a leak and it's sat there and hasn't been cleaned for 48 hours or more, that's enough to trigger it. The best way to measure for a water damaged building is not air sampling. Air sampling and spore traps are garbage. Okay, the WHO says they provide no benefit. So just because you had a guy come into your house and set up a tripod and measure the air for 5 or 10 minutes and say you don't have mold, that means nothing. He used a test that was garbage to begin with. Okay, the EPA in 2006 developed a test called the ERMI, which is much better. And then in 2011, an even better test than that called the HERTSMI 2 was developed. And so both these tests, rather than sample your air for 5 minutes and leave, both these tests have you collect mold spores and not just mold, but any microbial spores from the surfaces of your counters, from your carpets. You're vacuuming the most highly trafficked area of your house and picking up spores there and other contaminants and sending them off, and they're detecting what types of microbes are growing in your environment, not just the air, but also on your countertops and your carpets and your HVAC, wherever they may be. And so those are two ways to test it. And if you've got it, remediation, again, just because a guy has a truck that says remediation on it doesn't mean they do medically sound remediation. Medically sound remediation should look like a hazmat situation. Picture E.T. Remember at the end of the movie in E.T. when the government's coming to try and take E.T. from the little boy that has him? What's his name? Eli, or I can't remember his name right now. Elliot. And the guys show up and they're in these hazmat suits basically, and they look like aliens. That's how your home should look if it's being remediated properly. and that's often not done. So again, what might it look like if your water damage building, whether that's your home or your workplace, is causing your symptoms? Well, one way to test that would be if you think it's your home or you think it's your workplace, you're in there all the time, right? So you could take a week or two vacation and go stay with in-laws or parents, or go on a vacation to a place that you don't suspect is moldy or water damaged and stay there. And if over that week to 2 weeks you start to feel better, and then afterward you go home or back to work to the building that is suspected and you start to feel worse, that suggests that again the building is playing a role, because you left the offensive environment, you left the inflammation triggering environment and got away from it and gave yourself time to heal, and then you re-expose yourself and you got bad, worse again. So it's kind of a elimination provocation tool to check the building. Just like if you were having food reactions, you cut out the food for a while and then you reintroduce it and observe for symptoms. This is elimination provocation with a building. You get away from the building for a while, reduce symptoms, go back, they're worse, that suspects the building. Get an ERMI test or a HERS-Me2 test, test it, and we can go from there. So I know this is a lot of information and there's far more than this, just so you know, but this should help you understand out there if you're somebody with a multi-symptom, multi-system illness that's been told they have chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, or even worse, that they're crazy and pushed off and pushed away from the medical system. You're probably not crazy. You probably just have not been evaluated properly and by someone who even knows this condition exists. And so I'd encourage you to seek out somebody who understands CIRS and can evaluate you and then help address whatever is found moving forward, and hopefully help you return to what we call at Functional Medicine Charlotte, a life at optimal.